The eyes of the world are fixed on the U.S. and North Korea. More than that, the ears of the world are listening to every single word uttered by President Trump and Kim Jong-un. It's dramatic, but possible that global citizens could live or die by these words. The possibility of nuclear war with North Korea has gone from maybe one day to hopefully not today. The first thing that popped into my mind last night while we were on this show and heard these new threats was the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 excruciating days in October 1962, nobody knew if the U.S. would be attacked by Cuba using Russian nukes smuggled into that communist country. Not even President Kennedy knew if American cities would be obliterated. He decided to quarantine the island, only allowing in humanitarian aid, stopping any more Russian cargo. And then he spoke to the American people in black and white terms, on black and white TVs, laying out his plans and fears. He said this may only be the beginning. If it did come to nuclear holocaust, Kennedy told the nation, quote, "The fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth, but we won't shrink from that risk at any time. It must be faced."
I have directed the armed forces to prepare for any eventualities, and I trust that in the interest of both the Cuban people and the Soviet technicians at the sites, the hazards to all concerned of continuing this threat will be recognized. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
It's clear, listening to Kennedy and his Massachusetts accent, he did not relish this fight. He did some grandstanding in that speech, but only to show resolve, not to kick the opponent in the shin. The horrors of 1945, they were all too recent for that president. The young president, less than 2 years into his presidency, didn't want to make the same speech that Harry Truman did less than 2 decades before.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold.
Fast forward to today, 2017, President Trump's staff says he's trying his best to defuse the North Korean conflict, even as he issues threats of fire and fury. In tone, it couldn't be further from the reluctance of President Kennedy back in 1962. In muscularity, it's fairly similar. To better understand the overlaps and, more importantly, the lessons learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis, I spoke with Professor James Leibovic. He's a scholar of politics and government at George Washington University. Joining us now, James Leibovic, professor at George Washington University of Political Science and International Affairs. Sir, thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for the invitation.
We've heard a lot of comparisons lately to the Cuban Missile Crisis and what's happening right now between the U.S. and North Korea. Could you lay out some of the parallels?
What the Russians were planning on doing was placing missiles that did not have this long range, this intercontinental range, in Cuba, which would allow them to collapse the distance and hit targets throughout much of the United States. The similarity is that both countries were close to being able to threaten U.S. territory through their moves. These kinds of conflicts really do require cool-headedness. Unfortunately, we're not seeing that kind of conduct on either side, and frankly, it's troubling.
Do you see the U.S. as better prepared in 1962, Professor Leibovic, or today to respond to these nuclear threats that are coming from abroad?
Frankly, we're not in any better position. But I mean, in the end, it comes down to who you're identifying as the adversary here. I think what most Americans don't realize is just how formidable these current nuclear arsenals are.
Looking back to those 13 days, in the 60s that are so famous now, and you read accounts of President Kennedy staying up all night, couldn't sleep, was so worried he knew at any moment something could happen, and he worried that it would. Are there any lessons learned from back then that President Trump and his
members of his administration might take and apply to this situation?
A lesson that can be learned from that is to avoid rash decisions. They, from the beginning, did rule out doing nothing, but they were very cautious about moving too quickly and too forcefully. In part, and this points back to a profound similarity between Cuba and North Korea right now, military action could not assure that the threat would be entirely diminished. In the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Air Force could not assure U.S. leaders that they could get all the missiles. In the case of North Korea, I don't know whether with a preemptive strike, the United States could get all of its nuclear capability. The military is well aware of these potentials, and that's one of the reasons they're not cavalier about this military option. So Trump would be well advised to seek their counsel and listen to what they have to say carefully.